Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. On this week's video, we're in session number 4 of our new series entitled The New Era Qualified Medical Evaluator. And in this series, we're talking about some of the imminent and important changes that are upon us as qualified medical evaluators as our medical legal system goes through what appears to be a great upheaval with regards to the roles, with regards to the duties, and especially with regards to the compensation that is due to the qualified medical evaluator for the work that we do. And I have a fascinating program for you today, one that I'm sure is going to completely transform your operating principles moving here forward as a qualified medical evaluator, should you decide that continuing as a qualified medical evaluator is an appropriate path for you professionally and personally. And before we get into today's discussion, just like to review some of the topics that we've discussed so far in this program. And in this program, we're focusing largely on some of the new findings that have been described in the state auditor's report, which came out just a little bit over a month ago in November 2019. We're supplementing some of the state auditor's findings with some other important and recent research from the California Workers' Compensation Institute Research Update, which is a 2018 report, and the most recent published, at least as far as I'm aware of, Cheeswick report talking about trends in the qualified medical evaluation. So we're synthesizing some of the data from these 3 reports to ascertain where the future lies for the qualified medical evaluator. And in session 1, I preached to you about what appears to be a new great opportunity for the qualified medical evaluator who's sincere, who's motivated, and who wants to do a good job, and who wants to do a good job by the written rules, wants to do a good job by the book, wants to comply with labor codes and codes of regulation that dictate and govern the qualified medical evaluation, both in the face-to-face evaluation and then also in the preparation of the final report. It seems that in the last several years we've lost many qualified medical evaluators, and this trend appears to continue unabated as more and more qualified medical evaluators conclude that this simply is not the profitable work for them. It's not the work, the type of work that they thought would be a source of profit and a source of additional income for them. And they've concluded that the amount of work required to produce a high quality report is simply not justified by the current reimbursement rates. And that's a topic of hot debate raging right now in the QME community. But it's my opinion that as more and more qualified medical evaluators drop off, that is not in any way going to quell the demand for QME services. And so QME services are going to be distributed amongst a fewer number of qualified medical evaluators. If one of those qualified medical evaluators is you stand to receive a glut of cases in the very near future if you decide to stick it out. In session number 2, we continued on the theme of our first session, and that was entitled Get Ready for the Gold Mine. Again, we talked about why you can anticipate a new flood of phone calls requesting you for qualified medical evaluations. And we sort of provided a caveat in session number 2 for you to think about, and that has to do with the final opinions and conclusions in your QME report. It seems that the parties who read our reports have finally come to the end of their patience rope. Their patience has run out with qualified medical evaluators reports that do not resolve the issues. You see, qualified medical evaluators, and you may be guilty of this yourself, or you may know someone who operates this way, but qualified medical evaluators are notorious for muddying the waters and failing to resolve issues. In fact, qualified medical evaluators themselves have been known to create new and additional complex issues where before there were none. And so the qualified medical evaluator is not through their reports are not resolving the issues. Now, part of the source of this shortcoming, and we're going to talk at great length about it today, but part of the source of this shortcoming in qualified medical evaluators is that qualified medical evaluators do not have an adequate understanding of the roles of the other parties involved in the claim. Now, the same can also be said for claims administrators. The same can be said for applicant attorneys. The same can be said for defense attorneys. None of the parties, it seems, has an adequate understanding of the roles and duties of the other parties involved in the claim. And so part of the issue with qualified medical evaluators' low-quality reports, which was raised in the state auditor's report, November 2019, is that qualified medical evaluators do not understand the needs of the other parties and how the other parties depend on the opinions and conclusions in the qualified medical evaluators' reports. And so I'm here to tell you that in the near future, in the very, very near future, I mean, it's evolving even as we speak, your reports must qualify as substantial medical evidence to be of any use to any of the parties involved in the claim. And if you can qualify your opinions and conclusions as substantial medical evidence, number one, you can expect your reports to be paid for. Okay, so that's like priority number one. Your reports, first of all, will be paid for. And then number two, your reports can actually be used by the parties for the resolution of the case. If you cannot qualify your opinions and conclusions as substantial medical evidence, number one, your reports will no longer be paid. You'll be subject to disciplinary proceedings as judges reject your reports and provide a reporting document to the Division of Workers' Compensation citing the deficiencies in your report. And further, if the parties fail to be able to resolve issues on the basis of your report, you may be requested to provide a supplemental report to help clarify disputed issues. But under the new schema that's being described in the medical legal fee schedule, the new schema provides for zero reimbursement, goose egg, $0 reimbursement for supplemental reports that are simply requested by the parties to clarify issues that you failed to cover in the initial report. You'll be required to provide a supplemental report for no reimbursement if you cannot, on first pass, on your first opportunity, provide opinions and conclusions that can be used to resolve the issues. So we talked about the new importance of substantial medical evidence, and I showed you some very, very simple ways that you can start to tailor your opinions and conclusions in your very next evaluation. And that brings us to today's discussion. And what I want to talk to you about today has to do with reinventing yourself as a qualified medical evaluator. Now, you know, in life, the one thing that we can constantly count on is change. And many times, as inert creatures, we resist change. We abhor change. We rebel against change. Well, being a qualified medical evaluator is no different, but dramatic changes are now upon us. And these dramatic changes have to do with the reimbursements for the work that we do. Well, it seems if recent trends carry out into fruition in the near future, it seems that qualified medical evaluators can be expecting both simultaneously a pay raise and simultaneously a pay cut. And I'll explain that in just a minute. But the important point to note right now before we get into the pay is that procedures are changing. And it's now going to be required, and it's now incumbent upon us as qualified medical evaluators, that we adapt and adopt ourselves to the new changing system rather than rebel and complain about it. What's going to be required, and I'll just give you a little bit of insight into your future as a QME, it's going to be required that you streamline, and become ever more efficient in producing your final work product. So if you look at the entire process of creating qualified medical evaluation reports from the date that you receive your first phone call for a qualified medical evaluation appointment, all the way to the date and time when you put that report in the mail with a stamp on it addressed to all the parties, that entire sequence has to become ever more efficient, ever more systematized, ever less expensive. It needs to be quicker, it needs to be cleaner, it needs to be more concise, it needs to be more complete, it needs to be more definite, and it needs to be more definitive in getting confirmations from the parties, getting authorizations for studies, and getting everything that you need to produce that finished product 30 days after the face-to-face evaluation. The whole sequence has to get better. Now, I want you to not be surprised by this, because this is the nature of progress across all industries. We're now going to be required to produce more with less. We're going to be required to produce better for less. Better reports for less reimbursement. And I'm going to show you in today's session some exact steps as to how you can do exactly that. So with that as our introduction today, let's get into our discussion in part 4 of our new series entitled The New Era Qualified Medical Evaluator. And today we're talking about reinventing yourself as a QME. Okay, so let's begin today's session, which is reinventing yourself as a QME. And I have 3 topics I want to share with you in today's discussion that will help you shape your practices and shape your procedures for the future so that you can continue to enjoy some profit in the work that you do as a qualified medical evaluator. So I want to talk to you about some of the differences between liberal versus conservative QMEs. It seems that liberal and conservative QMEs have definite, different, and distinct fates in the QME system. I want to talk to you briefly about some new changes that are being proposed regarding the medical legal fee schedule. And I can report on these changes as a first-hand observer, as I was recently in attendance by invitation at a medical legal fee schedule meeting, wherein what are referred to as stakeholders in the system, all convened for 6 hours in downtown Oakland at the Division of Workers' Compensation to hash out and arm wrestle some new fee structures and new reimbursement schemes for the work that we do as qualified medical evaluators. And then I want to take those 2 concepts from conservative versus liberal QMEs and some ideas from the new medical legal fee schedule proposals and talk about how you can assemble those changes into transforming yourself as a qualified medical evaluator to streamline your procedures and become ever more efficient in the work that you do, so that no matter what happens, no matter what changes are upon us, you can continue to enjoy doing the work of a qualified medical evaluator, and the work continues to be a source of enjoyable profit for you that makes it worthwhile, at least, for you to continue in the work that we do, which all parties agree is very, very difficult work, and therefore it must serve as a source of reasonable profit for the qualified medical evaluator in order for the QME to continue in that line of work, and also for the system to be able to attract new qualified medical evaluators to replace those who have departed the system. Okay, so let's begin first by talking about conservative versus liberal QMEs. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about now has to do with the differences between conservative QMEs and liberal QMEs. And you've probably heard these terms referred to or applied to qualified medical evaluators. And this has to do with how the qualified medical evaluator opines in his final conclusions and determinations in the QME report, where conservative qualified medical evaluators tend to be very stingy in their AOE, COE determinations. They tend to be very stingy in their permanent impairment ratings. They tend to be quite considerate in providing for apportionment to other non-industrial factors in their apportionment determinations. And conservative QMEs are loved by employers because conservative QMEs have a tendency to reduce costs on the system with their opinions and conclusions, whereas liberal QMEs are loved by examinees and loved by applicant attorneys because they tend to opine heavily and more generously in the applicant's favor. Well, it seems that conservative and liberal QMEs are looked upon differently in the system. And so I want to share with you some findings from the recent Cheeswick study, which was published in 2017, entitled Updating Trends in Evaluations in the Availability of Qualified Medical Evaluators and in some of the financial issues involved with QME evaluations. With regards to qualified medical evaluators who tend to find themselves either suspended or under disciplined, those problem providers, suspended and disciplined providers, appear to be concentrated and represent a special issue. The pain specialties such as PAP, MAA, MPP, MPA, and even physical medicine and rehabilitation specialists, as well as internal medicine / hematology specialists as a collective group, had 15 to 17% of panels with a restricted or suspended provider on those 3-doctor panels. So if you take all of the panels that are generated over the course of a year in these specialties, all of the 3-doctor panels, 15 to 17% of those 3-doctor panels had at least one of those doctors on restriction or suspension in these specialties, the pain and internal medicine specialties. Now, other specialties such as orthopedics, such as neurology, such as chiropractic, such as acupuncture, have a much lower percentage. This is 15 to 17% of panels showing up with suspended or restricted providers. So it seems to be something about these types of providers that brings attention to their QME reports and brings attention to their practices and procedures and causes them to be subject to disciplinary proceedings by the Division of Workers' Compensation. Well, as it turns out, the restricted and suspended providers gave much more generous evaluations to injured workers than does the average qualified medical evaluator. So you can think of suspended and restricted providers as those providers that provide higher ratings. They have less frequent use of apportionment to non-industrial factors, and they have more frequent alternative impairment ratings under Alvarez and Guzman, which, as we know, has the distinct and direct purpose of escalating the permanent impairment rating. So when you think of the bell-shaped curve and the spectrum of qualified medical evaluators ranging from those that are extremely conservative to those that are extremely liberal and or generous, it seems that on the liberal end of the spectrum, that's where the majority of qualified medical evaluators who are suspended and or restricted, many of whom come from the pain specialties, this is where they lie. They lie on the liberal aspect or the liberal end of the spectrum of the bell-shaped curve. So what comes first? What comes first? Does the suspension come first? And then it's determined that the qualified medical evaluators are liberal? Or are qualified medical evaluators who are liberal, are those qualified medical evaluators drawing attention to themselves through their generous opinions and conclusions in their report? As we talked about in, I think it was session 1 of this program, we now live in an era of advanced analytics where the Division of Workers' Compensation can share data with many other governmental agencies, not the least of which, for purposes of this discussion, involves the DEU, the Disability Evaluation Unit. So the Disability Evaluation Unit has all your reports. They know your permanent impairment ratings. They know your tendencies on the use of apportionment. They know how often, through profiling of you, they know how often you use alternative impairment ratings under Alvarez and Guzman. You have a profile with the Division of Workers' Compensation through these advanced analytics that places you somewhere on the spectrum of conservative to liberal qualified medical evaluators. Well, it seems that the system tends to punish qualified medical evaluators who are more liberal, those who provide the higher ratings, those who have less frequent use of apportionment, those who more frequently use alternative impairment ratings under Alvarez and Guzman. These are qualified medical evaluators who are driving up the costs of the system. And lo and behold, it seems, according to the Cheesewig study, that these qualified medical evaluators come under scrutiny, which then leads to an exposure of some of their deficiencies, of course, which naturally leads to restrictions and suspensions. So that has to do with the liberal QMEs. On the other hand, we have conservative, stingy QMEs. Well, it's important to know that prior to the passage of Senate Bill 863 in 2013, which had as one of its purposes to reduce the number of QME locations that a qualified medical evaluator could conduct evaluations at. In fact, SB 863 limited the number of locations from unlimited prior to SB 863 to only 10. So SB 863 had as its intention to eliminate the very, very high volume QMEs, or to restrict QMEs from sequestering a very, very high volume of the available panels. So prior to SB 863, very high volume QMEs on average gave substantially lower permanent disability evaluations than the other 99% of all evaluators. In other words, the very high volume QME evaluators gave permanent impairment or permanent disability ratings that were 7 to 18% lower than average across the bell-shaped curve across the entire spectrum of QMEs. They were shifted, this group, the high volume group, was shifted towards the conservative end of the bell-shaped curve. Well, now after Senate Bill 863, talking about now, still the top 10% and the top 5% of QMEs, based on the number of panels that they are showing up on, they produce reports that show less bias than they did, less conservative bias than they did prior to SB 863, but still, even the top 5% of QMEs by volume rate only slightly more conservatively than average. So very high volume qualified medical evaluators tend to shift a little bit towards the conservative aspect of the spectrum, a little bit towards cost savings side of the spectrum. Liberal qualified medical evaluators are shifted to the expensive, cost-inducing side of the system, whereas conservative qualified medical evaluators tend to be conservative in their opinions and conclusions. They tend to be cost-saving in their opinions and conclusions. Okay, so we're starting to see a little bit different profiling of conservative versus liberal QMEs. These conservative QMEs, the top 5% of QMEs by volume, still rate lower than the average qualified medical evaluator, and in addition to rating lower, they more frequently apply apportionment to non-industrial causes. So imagine the double impact of this profile. Not only do they rate lower and provide lower permanent impairment ratings, they then take that lower permanent impairment rating and lower it further through more frequent apportionment to non-industrial causes. So here's the profile of a conservative QME. They have a reduction based upon their permanent impairment rating and their apportionment determination. They have double reduction in costs, whereas conservative QMEs provide for higher permanent impairment ratings with less frequent apportionment. Can you see the difference? The arithmetic or multiplicative effect of the differential in the profiling of conservative versus liberal QMEs. Can you see the impact on the expensive costs of the claim comparing conservative versus liberal QMEs? Well, they found, according to Cheeswick, that conservative QMEs, the busiest top 5% of QMEs across the whole industry, their ratings on average are 3.1 to 3.2% lower than average. That's just the ratings, which results in a 0.5 to 0.7% percentage points of final rating differential compared to the average. So when the qualified medical evaluator's permanent impairment rating is adjusted for age and occupation down at the disability evaluation unit, this group, the busiest group of QMEs in the whole state, provide for lower permanent disability ratings compared to the average qualified medical evaluator. And then the liberal QMEs go on the other aspect of the spectrum and provide for permanent impairment ratings significantly higher than the average qualified medical evaluator. Okay, so let's summarize these findings. It seems that according to the Cheeswick study, restricted and suspended qualified medical evaluators differ from the high volume qualified medical evaluators. High volume qualified medical evaluators are the evaluators that are getting the cases, that are being left as the last man standing on represented panels. Qualified medical evaluators, the high volume qualified medical evaluators, are in high demand. They are succeeding, they are surviving, they are avoiding restriction and suspension. Why is that? It might have something to do with where they've positioned themselves on the spectrum of the bell-shaped curve of conservative versus liberal QMEs. So the Cheeswick study concluded that restricted and suspended QMEs, through profiling and through the use of advanced analytics, sharing information between the DWC and the DEU, the liberal QMEs offer high percentages of permanent impairment, roughly 5.3% higher than average for the same type of case, for the same type of injury, for the same type of case. Liberal QMEs rate higher. Liberal QMEs have a high use of alternative impairment ratings under Alvarez and Guzman. In fact, they're 43% more likely to employ an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman than the average qualified medical evaluator. And as we know, the purpose of alternative impairment ratings under Alvarez and Guzman has only one purpose, and that is to provide for higher permanent impairment ratings than are provided for under the strict application of the AMA guides. And alternative impairment ratings have the impact of doubling, tripling, quadrupling, sometimes decoupling, which is tenfold increase in the impairment ratings compared to the strict impairments provided for by the AMA guides. Liberal or suspended and restricted qualified medical evaluators have low applications of apportionment to non-industrial causes. In fact, they're 6.7% less likely to apportion any disability to non-industrial causes. And so this has the effect of dramatically increasing the costs to the employers and the payers of these claims. And then finally, the generosity of these qualified medical evaluators who are playing with other people's money. They're very generous with other people's money. I sometimes tell my clients, my QME clients, consulting clients, if you're going to be so generous, be generous with your own money. You won't draw any scrutiny by being generous with your own money. But when you're extremely generous with other people's money, with the insurance company's money, you're certain to raise some eyebrows and raise some red flags by the claims payer. So unfortunately for restricted and suspended QMEs who have been profiled, it seems that their generosity exists even after the specialty has been controlled for, the year of rating has been controlled for, the worker characteristics have been controlled for. In other words, with apples to apples comparison, when all these variables such as impairment types and region of the state are controlled for, these restricted and suspended providers insist on being extremely generous with the claims administrator's money. So in reinventing yourself as a qualified medical evaluator, I'm not advocating for you to be either more liberal or more conservative or to shift your position to any particular end of the spectrum as a general practice. What I'm encouraging you to do is to simply seek truth and seek accuracy in your final permanent impairment ratings. You know, it seems that the very high volume qualified medical evaluators tend to be slightly conservative as a group. And it could be said, it could be inferred by these statistics that, or inferred from these statistics, that the very high volume qualified medical evaluators are the qualified medical evaluators that have the most experience. They have the most evaluations under their belt. And so as a group, why would they be shifted more towards the conservative side of the bell-shaped curve? Is it because they know something? Is it because they have a system for quickly arriving at accurate opinions and conclusions? Is it that they have a particular knack for discovering the truth in evaluations? Whatever it is, it seems that the system rewards slightly conservative positioning compared to slightly liberal positioning. And so if you're going to reinvent yourself and survive as a qualified medical evaluator, I suggest and recommend as a procedure moving forward that you always constantly seek truth and accuracy in your permanent impairment ratings, in your use of alternative impairment ratings under Alvarez and Guzman, and in your provision of some percentage of apportionment to non-industrial causes only because it's accurate, only because it's truthful, and only because it actually fits the facts of the case. Okay, so take a hint from the high volume QMEs, and in reinventing yourself moving forward, seek truth and accuracy in every single determination that you make, and you can never go wrong, and you can never fear coming under scrutiny by the Division of Workers' Compensation. Okay, so that's step one. Step two has to do with how to modify your procedures considering proposed changes to the new medical legal fee schedule. And so let's talk briefly about what now is known or what is now being proposed about the new medical legal fee schedule. Okay, so let's talk about the new proposed changes to the medical legal fee schedule. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because nothing is yet solidified regarding these changes. However, the stakeholders, the so-called stakeholders, are proposing some of these changes, and I'll share with you what seems to be gaining momentum in terms of those changes. Well, first of all, according to the recent state auditor's report, which came out in November 2019, the state auditor found the current pay scale for qualified medical evaluators to be woefully deficient. In fact, qualified medical evaluators have not received a pay raise, not even a cost of living increase, since 2006. Well, this is being recorded in 2020. So we as qualified medical evaluators have been operating under the same pay scale for 14 years, if you can imagine that. And meanwhile, executives and even employees down at the Division of Workers' Compensation are getting their regular raises, and yet qualified medical evaluators' pay has been static for much more than even a decade now. So all of the parties seem to be in general agreement that we as qualified medical evaluators deserve a raise, and the state auditor mentioned a raise of approximately 30%. So if we consider the hourly rate of qualified medical evaluators to be roughly $250 per hour, based on what we're allowed to charge for the time-based codes being ML101, ML104, ML105, and ML106, all of those provide for $250 per hour. So the state auditor is proposing that our fees now increase to $325 per hour, which is roughly the rate that agreed medical evaluators are now able to charge under the current medical legal fee schedule. So I don't know about you, but I have no problem with a pay increase to $325 an hour. That represents a 30% increase. And I don't know about you, but I would greatly welcome that type of a change. Well, the other side of the coin is that the parties, meaning the payers, aim to reduce the number of hours that qualified medical evaluators are devoting and dedicating to these reports. It kind of reminds me of a friend I had some years ago who came to me one day and he bragged that he had his hourly rate up to almost $1,000 per hour. Through due diligence and hard work and consistent commitment to his craft, he had escalated his hourly rate to almost $1,000 per hour. And then I asked him, well, how many hours are you getting? And he said that he was only getting about 2 hours a month. So even though his hourly rate was huge, he wasn't finding very many customers or payers willing to pay him that amount of money. And so it seems to be with the payers involved in paying our reports. They're willing to give us a pay raise, but at the same time they seek to reduce the overall reimbursements for our reports by condensing the number of hours that we're dedicating and devoting to these reports. And there's a whole series of flat fees for services that are now being established, or I should say now being proposed. There's flat fees being proposed for the initial exam. There's flat fees being established for the follow-up exam, if any, which is formerly under the former system, or I should say under the current system. Follow-up exams are billed as ML 101, correct? Follow-up exam, ML 101. Supplemental report, which is currently billed as ML 106, at $250 per hour, are now being proposed to be paid by a flat fee, which serves to reduce the overall compensation provided to qualified medical evaluators, even though the compensation rate is based on a pay raise of approximately $325 per hour. So I want to tell you a little bit about the most recent medical legal fee schedule meeting that I had the opportunity to attend by invitation, which took place no more than about 10 days ago. Okay, so let me tell you about the most recent medical legal fee schedule committee meeting that took place just days ago. I was there. And let me establish the scene for you. This took place in downtown Oakland at the Division of Workers' Compensation headquarters on Clay Street. And we had a large room reserved. The room contained about approximately 30 people. And the room was set up in a square. At the front of the room was the Division of Workers' Compensation, represented by 2 attorneys and perhaps 1 stenographer, or perhaps 3 attorneys, I'm not sure exactly. And the attorneys included well-known Division of Workers' Compensation attorney Winslow West. He was there. And then around the room, the other 3 sides of the square were what are referred to as stakeholders in the system. These are parties that have a vested interest in the medical legal fee schedule. And there was a couple of attorneys there who specialize in lien recovery for both primary treating physician and qualified medical evaluators. So they have an interest in the system. There were claims payers there from various insurance companies. Zenith Insurance Company was there. Schools Insurance Company was there. State Fund had a representative there. So these are the claims payers and the claims managers who are interested in the outcome of the medical legal fee schedule. They had a lot to say. There were representatives from what are referred to as QME aggregators. These are the QME practice management groups that have dozens, if not hundreds, of qualified medical evaluators operating under their umbrella. These groups were very vocal because they have probably the greatest vested interest in the outcome of the medical legal fee schedule proposals. And then also there were a small handful of qualified medical evaluators such as myself. There was a couple, maybe 2, 3 other qualified medical evaluators in the room, some of whom represented various groups such as the California Orthopedics Association, such as CSIM, which is the California Society of Industrial Medicine and Surgery. I believe there was 1 qualified medical evaluator who was just simply there as an interested party. And then I was there as a qualified medical evaluator and also as a continuing education provider. And so there was these various parties in the group. Now, little did I know that at this particular meeting, this was the 4th such meeting of the medical legal fee schedule committee. So the parties in the room prior to this meeting, which was my first attended meeting, the parties had already spent 3 entire meetings, 3 6-hour days together. And so it quickly became clear to me, attending on the 4th meeting, which was my first meeting, that a hierarchy had developed, a pecking order had developed, and power structures amongst the parties had already developed, with the QME aggregators having a lot to say and having a lot of control, actual physical control over the procession of the proceedings. So that's one thing that became quite clear to me. The second thing that became quite clear to me is that many of the parties in the room, or I should say all of the parties in the room, were present to discuss the QME situation and the QME reimbursement schedule. And yet there were only very few QMEs in the room. And it became quickly clear to me that none of the parties in the room who were non-QMEs had any understanding whatsoever of the roles and duties of the QME. Now, the parties in the room think they know. they think they know what a QME does, and they think they know all about what happens within the four walls of the face-to-face evaluation, and they think they know about what it is that a QME goes through from start to finish in producing the QME's report. But as a qualified medical evaluator myself, and as a continuing education provider myself, I quickly learned that the parties have no idea whatsoever as to what's involved in being a QME. And this is understandable, because put the shoe on the other foot, we as qualified medical evaluators have no understanding of the roles and duties of the claims administrators, because we've never done it. We have no understanding of the roles and the duties of the attorneys at the Division of Workers' Compensation, such as the duties of Winslow West, because we've never done it. And yet here were these groups present deciding the pay scale for the entire QME industry, and it became clear to me that they had no understanding whatsoever as to the roles and duties of the qualified medical evaluator. And perhaps the classic or the greatest example of that has to do with the great discussion that involved the review of records. Now, let's talk about the review of records for just a few moments, and let me explain to you why the current proposals being presented by the parties are not practicable, at least as relates to the review of records, if not the entirety of their proposals. Okay, so the parties are proposing that the system move towards flat rates for the various activities involved in various QME reporting processes. So, for example, for an initial face-to-face evaluation, the parties are proposing a flat rate based upon, the first proposal was based upon 400 pages of medical records. So anything less than 400 pages of medical records would be a flat fixed fee, and if the medical records exceeded 400 pages, then the QME can charge an additional fee per page beyond 400 pages. And this was argued back and forth about the numbers of pages, and we eventually settled on a flat rate fee, but based upon 200 pages of medical records. And the basic assumption behind this is that it takes approximately 1 hour to review 100 pages of medical records. And when I heard this estimation, I quickly concluded that the parties have no idea what's involved with a review of records. Guess what? Because they've never done it. Now, the parties don't realize that there are 4 laws involved with the review of records. There includes Labor Code 4062.3, Labor Code 4628A2, CCR 10606, and Title 8 CCR 41B2. All of these govern the review of records. And all of these laws tell us, as qualified medical evaluators, what's involved with the review of records. So in presenting our review of records to the parties, these various codes tell us what we're to do. They're telling us by use of their verbs that we are to identify, that we are to review and summarize, that we are to list. These are the various verbs involved with these laws and labor codes. We are to list and summarize all medical and non-medical records. So imagine that you receive a stack of medical records in the mail, and it consists exactly of 400 pages. Well, as you know, the first step in dealing with this stack of medical records is to sort the medical records and put the medical records in date order and eliminate all duplicates and fax cover sheets and unrelated documents and all this stuff to result in some book that represents the story of the examinee's medical treatment from earliest dates in time to most recent dates in time. And this sorting of the medical records takes time. It takes copious time. And one of the claims payers in attendance suggested that don't we as qualified medical evaluators have staff that can do this sorting for us? In other words, the amount of money that we're paid should be reduced, or could be reduced, by having staff spend time on the clock sorting medical records, when in actuality the medical records could have been stored at the insurance company. So they fail to understand the time involved in simply just the mechanical sorting of the medical records. Then the qualified medical evaluator, once he has those records sorted, he then must read the medical records. And this is what the claims payers consider to be the review of records, is the time involved with the qualified medical evaluator simply sitting down and reviewing the medical records. And that's part of the time, but that's not all of the time involved, because then the qualified medical evaluator has to sit down at his computer and go through the processes described by these 4 laws, such as reviewing and summarizing, such as identifying, such as listing and summarizing, such as listing, all of which takes time. And this is something that the claims payers do not understand about the roles and duties of the qualified medical evaluator, and this is just one such example. So as I sat there and I heard these parties and players go back and forth over these proposed changes to the medical legal fee schedule, I found myself asking myself, what in the evaluation is going to have to give? Something's going to have to give. In other words, the claims payers and these QME aggregators are agreeing on a lower flat rate fee for the work that we do. Something has to give if we're not going to be paid for the amount of time that it currently takes to complete these evaluations. Something has to give. And so I found myself wondering, well, what's going to have to give? Is it going to have to be the activities of daily living assessment that takes place in the face-to-face evaluation? The typical activities of daily living assessment takes approximately 20 to 30 minutes, depending upon whether an interpreter is involved or not. But it's an interactive exchange back and forth between the examinee in the face-to-face evaluation in order to arrive at true limitations to activities of daily living. It takes 20 to 30 minutes. Is that something that's going to have to give? What about the physical examination? Is that something that's going to have to be streamlined? Is that something that, despite what's required in the AMA guides, is that something that's going to have to be shortcut? For example, in the lumbar spine examination alone, there's 24 measurements required just to obtain a valid lumbar spine range of motion evaluation. It requires 3 measurements of lumbar flexion, 3 measurements of lumbar extension, 3 measurements of left lateral flexion, 3 measurements of right lateral flexion, 3 measurements of sacral flexion, 3 measurements of sacral extension, 3 measurements of left straight leg raise, 3 measurements of right straight leg raise. And all of this stuff takes time that the parties don't understand about the roles and duties of a qualified medical evaluator, and it seems that they don't care. So is the physical examination something that's going to have to give? What about the ordering of diagnostic studies, which are required by the AMA guides for the assessment of spinal impairments, for the assessment of lower extremity impairments, for the assessment of upper extremity impairments? But as we know, those of you that actively order and review these diagnostic studies, just the ordering and the authorizing, getting the authorization for these diagnostic studies can take 30, 40 minutes to just in getting the administrative process of the x-rays set up, getting the examinee confirmed to attend, getting the imaging facility on board, getting the x-ray technician on board with non-routine views that are required by the AMA guides can take 30 to 40 minutes. Once you obtain the images, reviewing the images, creating a report of findings, obtaining the measurements of motion segment integrity on the spine, obtaining measurements on cartilage intervals in the lower extremity, obtaining measurements for the assessment of carpal instability takes time, takes copious amounts of time, takes 30 to 50 minutes just to review the images and prepare the measurements or to obtain the measurements. Takes time. Is that something that's going to have to give if the parties insist on condensing the qualified medical evaluation? What about the qualified medical evaluator's opinions? All of the parties are insisting that the QME provide opinions that are substantial versus conclusory opinions. Well, if you make this your regular practice and procedure in the body of your report, you'll know that the time involved with providing substantial opinions takes forever. It takes forever as the qualified medical evaluator wrestles and wrangles with this complex medical decision making. So something has to give. And so let me give you some suggestions as to where to go from here. So with regards to the future as a qualified medical evaluator, the new era is going to involve you invoking some changes in your current practices and procedures. So I want to tell you that I don't expect these new proposals to the medical legal fee schedule to gain a whole lot of traction because they simply do not reflect the reality of the duties involved with the qualified medical evaluator. And I, for one, am going to continue to work with the committee to make sure that any changes to the medical legal fee schedule are reasonable proposals that adequately compensate qualified medical evaluators for the actual tasks and duties involved in producing our final product. But in the meantime, it's probably safe to say that some changes are upon us that are going to require that we become more streamlined in our procedures, that we be able to produce our final work product quicker with less overhead. And so I have the following suggestions for you moving forward in your career as a qualified medical evaluator. Number one is to seek accuracy in all determinations. And as you pursue accuracy in your critical determinations, such as your AOE, COE determinations, such as your permanent impairment determinations, such as your apportionment determinations, seek accuracy. Seek accuracy. If you seek accuracy, my suspicion is that your opinions and conclusions will shift slightly towards the conservative end of the spectrum, where qualified medical evaluators are apparently rewarded by the system compared to punished by the system. So seek accuracy in all determinations. Number two, you must have systems in place for every single aspect of every phase of the evaluation, such that the evaluation can proceed very efficiently. You must have efficient intake and scheduling systems. Now, as you know, if you have done any volume of qualified medical evaluations, simply the intake and scheduling administrative procedure can take nearly an hour to get in touch with the parties and to produce an appointment notification form and to contact satellite offices and to get all the ducks in a row can take an hour, and it must be streamlined and it must be systematized if you're going to thrive in the future in the new era of the qualified medical evaluation. Your review of records has to be systematized, and you may consider using a third-party organizer of the medical records so that you can get the medical records organized for $15 per hour versus spending your valuable time collating and organizing this disorganized stack that we get from the claims administrator. You must have systems in place to confirm every single aspect of the evaluation, especially the attendance by the examinee to the evaluation, because all will be lost in the context of a no-show appointment by the examinee. Even though the new proposals include more generous compensation for no-show appointments, it still represents a tremendous lost opportunity when you go to all the time, effort, and energy to set up for a QME evaluation that involves a no-show by the examinee. Must have systems in place for conducting the face-to-face evaluation so that it proceeds quickly and so that you can obtain the necessary physical examination data upon which to base your opinions and conclusions. And then finally, your medical decision making must be systematized so that you have a system to be able to quickly and accurately arrive at opinions and conclusions that are true, that are accurate, that are an actual representation of what's actual and factual. You have to actually get good and quick and systematize with your medical decision making so that number 3, this whole evaluation process from start to finish can be quick, can be streamlined, so that within whatever fee schedule is ultimately adopted upon, whatever that may be, whether the flat rate be small, medium, or large, or whether we be allowed to bill at an hourly rate, so that you can find some range of profitability within the fees that the parties are willing to pay for this type of work. If you can accomplish those things, you can arrive at the QME promised land. And just consider this another bump in the road of your career as a qualified medical evaluator. So doctors, I hope this helps you. Great changes are upon us now, and it's the resilient qualified medical evaluator who's flexible and who has the ability to adapt his or her procedures to the changing times and especially the changing fee structures that will survive on into the future and will continue to profit greatly by this very important work that we do. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's video. Look forward to being with you on future videos as well. And for now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.